such a great group of presenters for our global webinar series, and we really are honoured to have you with us, Ron.
Thanks for inviting
me. It's a pleasure. So yeah, I can see people from all over the world who are tuning in today to your session. And before we introduce Ron, we're just going to do a quick introduction to Mind Medicine Australia. Who is new on this webinar? If you put up your hand physically or with your, that's fantastic, wonderful. Well, welcome to Mind Medicine Australia. We'll give you a very short introduction about us in a moment. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the owners of the lands on which we stand, their elders past and present from wherever we are in the world, and also we acknowledge the incredible people, the light seekers, the medicine keepers who've brought these medicines throughout the ages from the beginning of human civilization to heal us and to help raise our consciousness. We acknowledge all of them. This is part of a recorded series that we do, and so this webinar will be put onto our YouTube channel, and it will also be shared with anyone who registered for this session. We hope you don't leave early, but if you have to, you will be sent a copy of the recording. Hands up too if you're therapists. Who's a therapist on the call? Lots of people, I imagine. Yeah, excellent. Now, Alan, do we have the short video that we could play? Fantastic.
Did you know that over 45% of Australians will experience mental illness in their lifetime? That's nearly half of us.
Everything feels flat and dry. I feel ashamed.
Mental ill health devastates lives and families and costs Australians around $60 billion a year. Research and treatment expenses continue to rise, yet rates of mental illness indicate that we're losing the battle. New approaches are urgently needed to address this immense suffering and cost. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is currently being trialled worldwide and has demonstrated remarkable promise in treating depression, anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder, with new trials underway for treatment of dementia and anorexia. The treatment combines a short program of psychotherapy with just a few medicinal doses of psilocybin or MDMA. In the 1950s and 60s, psychedelic treatments had a major impact in psychiatry, and many considered it the next big thing in mental health treatment. But for political reasons, the Nixon administration criminalised the use of psychedelics and effectively stopped all research. That research has finally begun again. With proper clinical support, psychedelic treatments are safe and frequently lead to remission after only a short program, and even where current treatments have failed. Here at Mind Medicine Australia, we believe everyone should have access to the best treatments for mental illness. We will seek to establish best practice in regulated psychedelic-assisted treatment. Mind Medicine Australia is wholly focused on the clinical application of psychedelic medicines. We're preparing for change by developing therapist training, ethical guidelines, a centre of excellence in psychedelic medicine, educational material and events, and supporting clinical research. We're a small organisation doing big things, and we need your support. Please share this video and visit our website to support us and get involved.
Excellent. So that's our short animated video, and we have a whole raft of different videos. We'd love you to share that. We're just going to show you just a few short introductory slides about Mind Medicine, and then I'm going to introduce Ron to you officially. So this session is called Learning from Non-Ordinary States, Mindfulness, Compassion and Psychedelics. And I'll introduce Ron with a bit more of his bio shortly. Just a reminder to all of you that we are focused on clinical use of these treatments, and so we don't facilitate illegal use. We are recording this webinar, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide, thank you. So in Australia, pre-COVID, 1 in 5 Australian adults had a chronic mental illness. pre-COVID, and 1 in 8 were on antidepressants, including 1 in 4 older Australians, kids as young as 4 being prescribed with antidepressants. As a result of the pandemic, it's now been suggested, and there's been some surveys that have been done that suggest 4 in 5 Australians now report poor mental health, and 34% of Australians said their mental health had declined in the pandemic. So we have a serious mental health crisis in this country, and it's getting worse. And a lot of other Western nations are also having a major mental health epidemic as well. Next slide, thank you. Unfortunately, in certain parts of the population, the incidence of mental illness is even higher. And of course, ADF veterans and first responders have a much higher incidence of all kinds of mental illness and addiction and suicidal ideation, and sadly, suicide. Next slide. Unfortunately, the cost of this is massive, and people with mental illness are more likely to be unemployed, they're more likely to have a disability, they're more likely to be homeless, and tragically, potentially may take their own lives. Next slide. So we say at Mind Medicine Australia, the elephant in the room is the lack of innovation and treatments for mental illness. And that has been the case for for over 50 years. So whilst we can talk about new patient access pathways, training more therapists, providing more subsidies, a whole range of different measures that the government implements, if we can't get to the root cause of a person's suffering, they're either going to stay in the system and keep seeking support, or sadly, many of them will drop out. But unfortunately, that's what leads as well to the incredibly long wait list for therapists, because at the moment, we're not getting enough patients out of the system healed and well. Next slide, thank you. So in the case of depression, if you're suffering from depression, or if one of your children is, only about 30 to 35% of sufferers experience remission from current treatments like antidepressants or psychotherapy. The rate of relapse is also very high, and there's very significant side effects for many patients. Of course, they do work for some patients, but they don't work for enough patients. Post-traumatic stress disorder, we have this terrible situation where remission rates are as low as 5 or maximum of 10% from current existing treatments. So more of the same is definitely not solving this problem. Next slide. So we're a charity, and my husband and I are philanthropists and social entrepreneurs. This is the 6th charity that we've set up between us. And our goal is to expand the treatment options available to medical practitioners, like many of you on this call, and your patients. And many of you are probably patients with lived experience as well. Our focus at the moment is on medicinal psilocybin for the treatment of depression and medicinal MDMA for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And these treatments are also being trialled now, as you saw on that video, for a range of other conditions. We're also interested in the use of ketamine, ibogaine, DMT, and other medicines of this class. For us, success means that these therapies become an integral part of our mental health system. That means if you go to your doctor, they'll give you a choice of current existing treatments like traditional psychiatric medications such as antipsychotics or antidepressants, and psychotherapy and psychedelic-assisted therapies, with full disclosure on the risks and benefits of each type of therapy, and of course ensuring that you are a suitable patient for this kind of treatment. It's important to say that these treatments do not suit everyone, and we want to make sure that all patients are properly screened, as they should be for any kind of treatment. In addition, our goal is that these treatments will continue to achieve the high remission rates that they've been getting in trials all around the world, an average of about 60 to 80% remission rates from nearly 200 trials that have either taken place or are currently taking place. And of course, it's incredibly important to us as a charity that these treatments are accessible and affordable to all Australians, no matter where they're located or their financial circumstances. And we are setting up a fund to help support those who can't afford to have or pay for these treatments themselves. Next slide, thank you. So the remarkable thing about these particular medicines is that they only require 2 to 3 medicinal sessions with a short course of psychotherapy, in contrast to for for many people is a lifetime sentence of a mental illness, feeling that you've got to take a daily tablet or more than one, that you're going to be in psychotherapy until, you pass out of this world. And the remarkable thing about these treatments is that they have been shown to be curative, not just managing the condition. They're considered to be very safe in medically controlled environments, non-addictive, and both have been granted breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA in the US. And that's a very rare designation only given to medicines that could be vastly superior to existing treatments to fast-track the approval process. Next slide, thank you. So what happens with these treatments, and I'm sure Dr. Ron's going to talk about this further, but what we're seeing is that these medicines help to bypass the default mode network of our brain, which Robin Carhart-Harris has talked about in some of his wonderful research. The default mode network is what keeps us stuck, defaulting to our rigid thought patterns, often from early childhood. As we showed in the video, I'm not good enough, no one loves me, things will never work out for me. And you can see examples here of representations of fMRI scans on the right, and the far right circle is placebo, somebody who is suffering with depression. You can see the very limited neural connectivity that's occurring. In the circle on the left, though, you see the ingestion of the psilocybin that leads to this massive neurogenesis, this increased neural plasticity, multiple different parts of the brain talking to one another, leading to a sense of oneness and connection with self, others, and the planet, which is why these medicines provide a window of opportunity where trained clinicians can work with patients to really fast track their healing, and where patients become an agent for their own healing. They feel empowered to break out of their repetitive styles and repetitive thought loops instead of taking a daily tablet to, in a sense, give responsibility to a third party. So they become really agents for their own healing. And these medicines do provide an incredible window of opportunity for people to get better, to heal, to connect. And of course, what characterizes most mental illness is a sense of disconnection, of isolation, of separation, of loneliness. And next slide, thank you. So Mind Medicine Australia is focused on building the ecosystem in Australia and throughout Asia Pacific. And so we do that through 4 key strategic pillars. One of them is awareness and knowledge building. So events like today, where we invite some of the leading clinicians and academics in the world to speak to all of you. We also had a major international medical summit last November, and we're looking at potentially doing one in 2023. We also have chapters all over Australia to raise grassroots awareness and run events and build local movements towards demanding access towards these treatments. And we also partially fund research all over Australia. We're also responsible for unlocking a $15 million grant from the federal government, which has unleashed 7 trials around Australia. We also started the first professional development program, Mind Medicine Australia Certificate in Psychedelic-Assisted Therapies, which commenced in early 2021. Professor David Nutt recently described it as a world-leading training program, and we have a wonderful faculty. It's a 4-month part-time program for psychotherapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, GPs, physicians, nurses, paramedics, social workers, occupational therapists, and other trained, experienced clinicians. And we really invite you to register your interest if you're interested in that. We'll announce some dates for 2023 shortly. We also have an online 4-week course called Fundamentals of Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy. We also work a lot with universities and help set up the Neuromedicine's Discovery Centre at Monash Uni, and we also are looking at the preferred legal and ethical frameworks. So as many of you will know, we put in the second submissions to the Therapeutic Goods Administration for the rescheduling of MDMA and psilocybin, and there's an interim decision expected in the next few weeks. We would love all of you to support us further with those rescheduling submissions, and if the interim decision is negative, we please ask you to write to the TGA through their official channels and get everyone you know to write to them. And it's really important that we start to demand access to safe and effective medicines. We're also interested in the manufacturing of the medicines, the rollout of clinics, and so on. Next slide, thank you. So Tim Ferriss says, you know, he sees the next 5 years as an absolutely golden window. He's a philanthropist and entrepreneur who's donated a lot of money into this field because he sees the potential impact. There is a game-changing opportunity here where these treatments could help heal millions of people who are treatment resistant to other existing treatments at the moment. Next slide, thank you. How you can help, well, we always get asked this, you start conversations, share this webinar, join our chapters, or if there's not one near you, start one yourself and we can help you with that. We have an amazing Learn section on our website. Talk to your doctors and medical professionals. Every time I go to a GP, I say, have you heard about psychedelic-assisted therapy? And quite often they haven't. And I give them a link to our website, and then they start registering for our webinars, joining our training and so on. So it's just word of mouth. We're a small charity doing big things, and whilst Peter and I are philanthropists, we can't do this alone, and we rely on the philanthropic support of small and large donors. And just for 2 cups of coffee a week, you can become a regular donor and just support the incredibly important work that we're doing. Talk to your local, state and federal members of parliament, demand change. Attend our upcoming events. We've got an amazing webinar series coming up with some other extraordinary people. Next slide, thank you, Alan. This is about our 4-week online course. Next slide. Our CPAT course, and join our chapter. And we also have some wonderful goodies that you can get, ranging from masks to some beautiful mushroom gift cards, T-shirts, and Australia's first book of psychedelic healing stories, which features 53 Australians. Next slide. Very excitingly, I'm pleased to announce that we're bringing Professor David Nutt to Australia in November, and he'll be presenting a series of live keynotes in November around Australia in the Byron Shire, in Canberra, in New South Wales, and in Victoria. So please reach out to us, and if you are interested in presenting David on his very limited dates in Australia, please reach out to us as soon as possible. He is an absolutely brilliant presenter and, of course, one of the leading researchers in this space. Next slide, thank you. And these are some of our upcoming events. So you can see we have Dr. Reid Robertson coming up, speaking on eating disorders, Bessel van der Kolk, James Fadiman, Richard Swartz. It's an amazing lineup coming up. We really welcome you to join all of our upcoming events. And with that, I am thrilled to introduce you to Ron. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him. Ron. So I don't know which of this to read, but I'm going to read. I mean, it's so impressive, Ron, that every time I read your bio, it's I learn more about you. But Ron Siegel is a long-time student of mindfulness and meditation and serves on the board of directors and faculty of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy. He teaches internationally about mindfulness in psychotherapy and other fields, and he's got a private clinical practice in Lincoln in Massachusetts. He's author of a new book I recommend you all go out and get, called The Extraordinary Gift of Being Ordinary, Finding Happiness Right Where You Are, and a comprehensive guide for general audiences. The Mindfulness Solution, Everyday Practices for Everyday Problems. Both those are wonderful publications. He's also co-editor of critically acclaimed texts, Mindfulness and Psychotherapy, Wisdom and Compassion in Psychotherapy, and co-author of the professional guide, Sitting Together, Essential Skills for Mindfulness-Based Psychotherapy, and the self-treatment guide, Back Sense, which integrates Western Eastern approaches for treating chronic back pain. He's also Professor for the Science of Mindfulness, a research-based path to wellbeing produced by the Great Courses. He serves as a mentor on the California Institute of Integral Studies program in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and he's co-director of the annual Harvard Medical School Conference on Meditation and Psychotherapy and Psychedelic-Assisted Psychotherapy. So with that, Dr. Ron Siegel, we're thrilled to welcome you to present to us for about, I'd say around about 25 to 30 minutes, and then Q&A. Is that what you've been told?
I have a little bit longer than that, but I'll shorten it for that.
No, well, whatever. No, we don't want to shorten
Okay.
it. But yeah, let's try and leave us a little bit of time for Q&A.
I will. So thank you for that introduction. Thank you for orienting everybody to the great work that you're doing there down under. What I'm going to share with you now are some thoughts about learning from non-ordinary states, because as it turns out, non-ordinary states have played a central role in psychotherapy since its inception. This is nothing new. And the advent of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is simply one application of this. And what I want to share with you are some of the reasons why human beings have so much difficulty with psychological distress and why we spend so much time unhappy or downright miserable, and how using non-ordinary states might provide antidotes to that. And we'll talk about mindfulness states, compassion practices, and psychedelics, and I'll try to do all of that in a very brief period of time. Let me share some slides with you here. Okay, can you see that okay? Okay, so let's start at the beginning here. Just a few words about the history of this. It goes all the way back to music therapy on the part of the ancient Egyptians. There are many, many ways in which people throughout history have looked for ways to help people step below the thought stream to connect with experience that's different from our normal chatter, different from the way in which we typically go through a day talking to ourselves about ourselves. In relatively modern times, we have the development of hypnosis, or what was called rational mesmerism in 1850, that was miraculously curing people of all sorts of what we would now call conversion disorders. And this is what intrigued the relatively young neurologist Sigmund Freud to eventually develop psychoanalysis that has several elements, such as free association, which is a distinctly non-ordinary state in which people allow themselves to simply go into the free reverie of whatever comes to mind rather than rational analytic thought, and the use of dreams, which serve a similar purpose of trying to get people out of rational thought and into connection with inner experience. Mindfulness practices have a long history in healing, going back to the Buddhist teaching some 2,500 years ago. And they were for this purpose of, again, stepping below the thought stream and being able to connect to other ways of knowing in order to free us from a source of psychological suffering. Mindfulness practices came into psychotherapy in the 1990s to the 2000s, started with Marshall Linehan and dialectical behavior therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and then the work that my colleagues and I started doing in mindfulness and psychotherapy, and looking for ways to develop mindfulness-oriented treatments. Now, psychedelics also have a long history here, right? Psychedelics seem to date from about 8,000 BCE. This is a picture that was found in some caves in the Sahara Desert. And you see the mushrooms on the arms of this god, suggesting that people had interest in this going back a long ways. And as you saw in that little video at the beginning, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy actually had a huge impact in the 1950s and the 1960s. There were over 1,000 clinical papers published in the professional literature with the aggregate experience of some 40,000 patients or subjects. Now, these studies weren't done at the current standards of randomized controlled trials, but nonetheless, they looked very promising, and they did indeed have the potential to revolutionize psychiatry. So the question is, why do we need these? Why do human beings have so much psychological distress? And what I want to suggest to you is a model that shows how, frankly, the human brain evolved for survival, but not particularly for psychological well-being. And as such, it sets us up, our evolutionary history sets us up for countless different kinds of suffering. And I'm going to share with you some of those particular kinds of suffering, and then look at how these non-ordinary states can actually serve as antidotes to each of them. And so I'd like to begin with a story. And this is a story about the boys and girls who a number of years ago finished writing the DSM-5. For those of you who aren't mental health professionals, that's the diagnostic manual that we use to categorize different kinds of emotional suffering. And there was a battle that broke out among them. And it might be categorized as a battle between the lumpers and the splitters. And the splitters thought what was missing in the previous version, in the DSM-4, was that we didn't yet have sufficient diagnostic categories. We needed more accurately target pharmaceuticals and 10-week treatment programs. The lumpers typically would hear this, and they were practicing clinicians, and they'd kind of roll their eyes, and they'd say, really? More categories? In my clinical practice, I rarely see somebody with a single DSM-4 diagnosis. A lot of times people have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And to be perfectly honest, the diagnosis changes from week to week. I don't see how more categories are going to help. In fact, say the lumpers, I'm afraid we're going to miss the forest for the trees. The splitters found this very confusing, and they said, what forest? And the lumpers said, you're going to miss the universals in human psychological suffering. And if we could identify these universals, then we could perhaps target them and help a very broad range of people with our various interventions. At this point, the splitters are completely confused, and they say, universals? That's like saying, what's the universal between syphilis and a broken leg? They're both problems, but isn't it important to differentiate between them, to treat them differently? And the lumpers say, actually, no. And what I want to do is guide you through a number of these commonalities that cut across the different psychological disorders or psychiatric syndromes. The first of these is emotional or experiential avoidance. And we can see this in many realms. Let me make it so that I can see most of you. In fact, I think I'll stop my screen sharing for a moment. And if you would put on your cameras so I can see you. And how many of you ever drink alcohol? How many of you ever drink alcohol? Okay, quite a few. Probably in Australia, I'm going to think almost everybody. Okay, how many of you who drink alcohol now, and be honest, do it exclusively for the taste, only for the flavor experience? You have no concern with psychotropic effects. Sometimes in places like Australia or Northern California, people say, yes, I do it just for the taste. But if I think of our ancient ancestors out there in the savannah, and they had a tree that had ripe, luscious fruit, and they tasted that. And then there was no fruit someday, and there was stuff on the ground rotting, and they tasted that. I don't think they preferred that rotten fruit on the ground, but they ate it because they're hungry, and then they noticed something interesting happened. The alcohol in the fruit had a certain effect, and they thought, oh, how can I make more fruit rotten? How can I capitalize this and have these effects? Typically, when we use alcohol, we want to change one state of mind into another state of mind. Maybe we're tired and tense after a day of clinical work and musculoskeletal. We look something like this, and we think, a drink might not be a bad idea. Or we're going to a party, and there are going to be people there who we don't know, or perhaps worse, people there who we do know. And we think, a drink might make this go a little bit more easily. Changing one state into another state. If we do this from time to time in moderation, no problem. But of course, people who compulsively need to do this or need to do it with other substances have a real problem in their life. So we see that experiential avoidance, trying to get rid of a certain unpleasant state, plays a role in our substance use issues. Let's look at anxiety. If I get anxious before public speaking or anxious before riding in airplanes, but I do those things anyway, I don't have an anxiety disorder. I'm just a nervous guy. If, however, I avoid public speaking or avoid flying in airplanes in order not to feel the anxiety, that's the pathway to an anxiety disorder. And there was an astronaut I once heard being interviewed by an actor who was going to play him in a movie about the early space program. And he wanted to play him faithfully. So he said, I don't understand it. How did you have the courage to go up in those early spacecraft? I would have been terrified. And the astronaut said, you don't understand courage. Courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about doing what needs to be done as we feel the fear. Again, experiential avoidance, trying not to feel something uncomfortable, is at the heart of a disorder. And even though depression is quite complex, if we look at the difference between sadness and depression, and we've all felt sad and we've all felt depressed, they have a different feel to them. They have a different quality. Sadness is alive, it's engaged, it's interactive. We can be at a funeral and be very sad about the departed, but somebody tells a story about something funny that happened and we're there, we're alive, we remember it. While depression, the whole nervous system is shut down. We're not actually feeling very much feeling. We're just stuck in ruminative thoughts about ourselves and about our inadequacies. And the whole system is out of touch, which is why we feel this anhedonia, why we can't connect to anything. So we see that even in depression, there's this role of experiential avoidance. And we could even make an argument for this with psychosis. I'm not suggesting that there aren't other factors, that there aren't biological predispositions, that our attachment histories don't play a huge role. All of that's true. But the actual mechanism here is one of avoidance. So let's look at some of the other mechanisms. Are you on the next slide? Do you see a picture of Lucy? Yep. Okay, so this is an artist's conception of Lucy. And she's our great, 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 great grandmother. And she was alive on the African savannah some 4.5 million years ago. And we know she survived because we all have her DNA. But how did she survive? She was about 1 meter tall. Her hide wasn't very protective. Imagine coming face to face with a lion, gritting her teeth and showing her claws. What's the likelihood that that was going to scare the lion off? She wasn't very fast. If you ever go on a so-called walking safari in Africa, the first thing they tell you is, no matter what happens, just don't run. Why? Because everything scary out there is faster than you are. So what'd she have going for her? Well, she had a prehensile thumb that she was going to help make tools eventually. She was a social creature, so she could interact and cooperate with her peers. She had a fight or flight system, so she could react to emergencies. But her real ace in the hole, the thing that Lucy developed, or Lucy's offspring developed, that no other animals had developed so far, so in such a sophisticated way, was the ability to think, right? Lucy had the ability to analyze the past for pleasure and pain and figure out how to maximize future pleasure and avoid future pain. But this capacity for thinking is not just some neutral computer. It's subject to what cognitive scientists call a negativity bias, or what my friend Rick Hansen says, the brain evolved to be like Velcro for bad experiences and Teflon for good ones. Bad experiences stick, good ones slide right off the pan. And there's very good reason for this, because if you could imagine Lucy out there on the African savannah, she could have made one of two types of errors. And they actually correspond to type 1 errors and type 2 errors in modern scientific research. A type 1 error would be to look at an ambiguous situation like a beige shape behind some bushes and to think, oh my God, it's a lion, when it's really just a beige rock. A type 2 error would be to say, it's probably a beige rock, when it's really a lion. Now, Lucy could make countless type 1 errors and still pass on her DNA. One type 2 error, and that was the end of her genetic line. So we might imagine there were happy hominids in Lucy's day, remembering dynamite sexual encounters and luscious pieces of fruit and telling stories about these things. But they weren't our ancestors, because statistically, they died before they got to reproduce. Our ancestors were the ones wandering around the savannah going, uh-oh, that could be a lion. Oh no, that looks like a poisonous snake. Not another one of those plants. What do you call them? Wait-a-whiles in Australia. I remember the last time I got caught in one of those. Oh no, a cliff. And what we see when we start to examine the contents of the mind is so often what the mind is doing is it's living in fear. It's imagining bad things happening and it's reacting to that, causing countless suffering, causing a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, actually driving a lot of substance use disorders. And on top of this, our brains have a tendency toward reification. What do I mean by that? They have a tendency to see as solid things that are fluid. everything in the universe, everything in consciousness is actually constantly changing. But to navigate the world, we need to think of it as being kind of stable so that we can predict and control and plan. Oh yeah, that's where the fruit is. Oh yeah, I planted those crops there. Let me go check on them and see if they're ready for harvesting. But the problem with this tendency to see things as solid is we tend to get stuck. We tend to think that things are going to persist. So, for example, when we get anxious or depressed, it's not the moment-to-moment feeling of anxiety or depression that's so problematic. It's imagining that it's never going to go away. I'll never feel okay. I'll never be happy again. And this reification also blends over into how we view ourselves. We actually think that we are somehow solid, and many of us have the imagine that we're going to live forever. And as though that weren't problematic enough, we become very concerned with our social rank and how we compare to others. And this is yet another universal in the source of psychopathology. And this also stems from our life on the savannah. If you go around on a so-called safari with a naturalist, they will point out a pattern in group after group. There's a dominant male surrounded by a group of reproductively promising females. And over in the next field, there's a group of usually younger males doing the species-specific equivalent of playing football, practicing their skills to try to become dominant again. Almost all social mammals have these dominance hierarchies. Birds do, we call them pecking orders. There are species of crickets that if you put them in a box, inside of a few seconds, they'll organize themselves into a dominance hierarchy. What's up with this? Why are so many animals concerned with these hierarchies? Primates do it big time. Well, the reason is that those primates that had more dominance had more access to resources, were better able to reproduce, and frankly, were better able to pass on their DNA and protect their offspring that had that DNA. So here again, we might imagine happy hominids who are completely tuned into cooperation, completely tuned into love on the African savanna. They too weren't our ancestors because they didn't get to reproduce quite as often as the ones who were big on these dominance hierarchies and were always striving to be on top. Now, the way this manifests in modern humans is with self-esteem concerns. And enter any therapy session, and chances are you'll find that there's concerns with how am I doing and how do I compare to others. Almost everybody I see in treatment is either feeling inadequate and less than others, or they're feeling good about themselves, but they're desperately trying to keep up their achievements, make sure they're getting likes on Facebook, make sure they're earning money, make sure people like them in order to keep this good feeling about ourselves. And this is a tremendous drain of our resources and causes, again, tremendous psychological suffering. So these are the 4 evolutionarily determined tendencies of the brain that we're going to address with non-ordinary states of consciousness. It's the tendency to try to avoid pain, very deeply hardwired. It's the ability to think, but when we think, we get stuck in the negativity bias, so our thoughts tend to go in a problematic direction. It's the tendency to reify things, to see the world as solid when it's actually fluid and ever-changing. And this belief that somehow we exist as a separate human being and we can be better or worse than other human beings, that we somehow believe ourselves to be separate from the ecosystem and then have constant struggle and strife trying to maintain good feelings about ourselves. The antidotes to this that non-ordinary states can bring us are going to be, instead of experiential avoidance, befriending our demons, moving toward everything in consciousness that we find difficult to accept and open to. Instead of believing in our thoughts and getting stuck in the negativity bias, we're going to be developing metacognitive awareness, the ability to see that a thought is actually just a thought rather than a reality. Instead of being caught in reification and thinking that things are solid, we're going to really observe the amazing fluidity of the universe and how everything is always changing. And guess what? If we don't like a certain circumstance, just wait a moment, it's likely to change. And then finally, to really shift beyond this narrow view of ourselves, and particularly this kind of competitive looking out for number one view of oneself, to develop transpersonal awareness, to really see that this organism is part of a larger ecosystem, it's part of a larger universe. Everything that's born is going to die, and to actually experience the love and connection that comes from moving out of self-preoccupation. Now, mindfulness and compassion practices in their history and Buddhist and other psychological traditions were all about doing these things. My colleagues and I, when we started teaching about this, defined therapeutic mindfulness as awareness of present experience with, and this is a modern modification, loving acceptance. And it turns out when we look at the clinical results of mindfulness practice that being able to pay attention, that's not so important. Certainly being able to steady the mind and remain with an object of attention, that's not so important. Having loving acceptance toward whatever arises in consciousness, that is what predicts clinical improvement and well-being. And if you'll join me for a moment in just a little exercise, take a moment to look at this fellow and take a breath or two and notice what you feel when you look at him. And raise your hand if your dominant feeling is harsh, critical judgment. If so, send me an email and we'll talk later. But most of us, when we look at him, feel something like the universal experience of compassion, which is a sound like this. Oh. Now, even if he were to pee and poop at the wrong time and not listen to instructions, we'd still think he's young, he needs training, he needs love. What we see in mindfulness practices is that the mind does pee and poop at the wrong time. It does not listen to instructions at all. It's this attitude of loving acceptance that becomes critical. So many people enter psychotherapy wishing that they could get a whole new personality. Oh, I'll get into therapy and I won't have to be annoying Ron anymore. I'll get to be like somebody I look up to, one of those other people. When therapy goes well, what happens is we end up very much ourselves, only we're friends with that person. And we're at home with the crazy mix that happens to be me. This too is where we're going with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies. There are a lot of synergies between mindfulness practice and psychedelic-assisted therapy. I'll just name a few. Mindfulness practice is very useful for preparation sessions before a medicine session, to develop this attitude of moving toward experience, not believing so much in the thoughts as they come and go, noticing that all is impermanent, not being so self-preoccupied. All of these are excellent training for a productive medicine experience. They're useful for enhancing therapist presence during the training. And then they're useful for integration because they give us a way to work with the material that has come up, both the transpersonal insights that may have come up, as well as all of the different thoughts and feelings that the psychedelic medicines allow us to connect with. So let's look a little bit about the antidotes. So the first one is befriending our demons. Long history of this with mindfulness practice. Many of you probably know the story in the legend of the Buddha, in which at a certain point, after developing all sorts of skills at meditation and concentration, he was still finding that when he wasn't actively meditating, I'm going to paraphrase here, all his old neurotic patterns came back up. So he went out and sat under this tree that became known as the Bodhi tree. And for some 40 odd days and nights, he sat there to see how the mind works and how it creates suffering. And he was visited by lots of pleasant images, sexy maidens, that kind of thing, and lots of unpleasant material, demons and devils, and basically all the negative stuff in our minds that we tend to push out of awareness. And he learned to befriend it. He learned to stay with all of this and stay with his seat. That is very much the befriending of demons that happens when we are doing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and that we use mindfulness and compassion practices for. Metacognitive awareness. Increasingly, we see that thoughts aren't facts and I am not my thoughts. This is why CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, has been so powerful in the field generally, because people have noticed, gosh, it's our thoughts that create so much of our suffering. Take a moment right now to just think of something that upsets you. Not the worst thing ever, but something that you find upsetting. Okay, right now, here and now, if it weren't for the thought of the thing, would you be having a problem? And usually the answer is no. Even if the problem is physical pain, it's the thought that it's going to endure for a long period of time that becomes the source of the suffering, right? So to the extent to which we can see thoughts as thoughts and allow them to come and go, and both psychedelic work and mindfulness and compassion practices aid this, to the degree we can do that, we're going to become freer. Embracing impermanence. The more we see that everything's changing, the less we're going to cling to things being a certain way. And in particular, the less we'll cling to visions of ourselves. And this is where the transpersonal awareness comes in. Now, transpersonal awareness has a rich history in the field of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. A few miles from me, there's the Marsh Chapel of Boston University, in which took place the Good Friday experiment in 1962. And this was part of the Harvard psilocybin project that Tim Leary and Richard Alpert, who later became Ram Dass, were part of. And a young psychiatrist by the name of Walter Pahnke did a doctoral dissertation there, where he prepared people to bring with them religious artifacts and things that reminded them of their spiritual life. And these were actually theology students. And he gave them a dose of psilocybin in this chapel on Good Friday, and found that the vast majority of them had some kind of mystical experience. And he actually, back in 1962, developed a scale for measuring these mystical experiences that we still use today. And it was things like a sense of internal unity, not being divided, external unity, being connected to the wider world, noetic quality, a kind of deep meaning to it, sacredness, positive mood, transcendence of time and space, and ineffability, difficult to describe. What we see in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is one of the big predictors of whether people are going to have clinical improvement is whether they can get out of their preoccupation with themselves and have this kind of connection. I won't go through this in detail, but these are just a few studies, all of which show a correlation between the degree of mystical experience and clinical improvement. Because my presentation is of necessity very brief, but you may have interest in this, if you want more information, you can do this right now on your phone or on your computer. Send a blank email to handouts@yahoo.com and just put in the subject line Australia, and I'll be in communication with you, and I'll send you some more stuff about these topics. I'll put this up again in a moment, but it's handouts@yahoo.com, subject line Australia, and I'll share more information with you. So let's talk about this transpersonal awareness. We could get into the neurobiology of it. I'm afraid we won't have time for that today, but indeed, when we are having these transpersonal experiences, as Tanya alluded, the default mode network tends to quiet down, and that very same default mode network tends to quiet down in mindfulness practices. And what happens is we shift from a narrative mode in which we're talking to ourselves about ourselves to this experiencing mode where we're simply noticing emotions coming and going in the body, and we're not so caught in the narratives about them. And one of the fruits of this is the possibility of some freedom from self-esteem concerns. And just to give you a taste of this, almost all of us have some qualities that we use to try to feel good about ourselves. They fall into different realms: skills and talents, accomplishments, group membership, relationships, values, physical attributes. But if I were to ask you to close your eyes just for a moment now, we'll do one brief last exercise. And I were to share with you a few possibilities. See if any of these ring a bell. Have you ever been concerned with whether you were intelligent or not? Or if people thought you were smart or not? Or who was smarter when talking to other people? Have you ever had concerns about being sufficiently creative? About being somebody with a good sense of taste, or with artistic and aesthetic talent? Has athletic ability ever mattered to you? Being good at sports, other people being better, or you being better? Or accomplishments, earning a degree, getting respect, having money. Have these things ever made you feel better or worse about yourself? Group membership, have you ever felt good or not so good about your family, about your racial group, your sexual orientation, your gender, your social role, and relationships, feeling good or not good about yourself for being a good parent or a good child, sibling or coworker, living according to your values, being kind, being honest, being generous, or feeling not so good for not being so kind, generous, etc. Or of course, physical attributes, feeling good about looking good, being physically attractive, being sexy, being fit, or feeling bad about being too heavy or too short or some such. So as I went through that list, if you would, by just raising your physical hand, how many of you found that, well, at least one of those rang a bell? Yep, it's been a concern for me. How many of you noticed that actually more than one rang a bell and has been a concern? How many of you found that nearly all of them rang a bell or did at one point in your life? And I got to tell you, I came up with this list through careful scientific research. I just thought about it for about a month. And every time another one of these came up that was going on in my own mind, I added it to the list. And what we find is that all of us are preoccupied with this stuff. And one of the great, great benefits of increasing transpersonal awareness is simply seeing the folly of it. And one of the things that comes from seeing this folly is that we learn to safely connect to others. And I'll just sum this up really briefly and then we'll stop. A good friend of mine is an unusual human being because he's a Harvard psychiatrist, he's a psychoanalyst, he's a Zen master, and he's also the head of the Harvard study of adult development. And they've been studying 724 men for the last 75 years since 1938. Half were Harvard students, half were poor young men in Boston, 6 are still alive. And what they're interested in was what was the predictor of well-being, what actually works. And Bob Waldinger, the guy who's heading the study, says, the jury is now in, we know. It's the quality of our relationships. People who feel safely connected to others thrive physically and they thrive psychologically. And one of the enormous benefits of the transpersonal experiences that come out of psychedelic-assisted work and that come out of mindfulness practice is this ability to drop the concerns with how we're doing, drop the pride concerns, not entirely because we're hardwired for it, but to some degree, and out of this to connect to others. And we learn, instead of going through life trying to make an impression, trying to make other people think that we're smart or clever or funny or beautiful, we start to go through life trying to make a connection, trying to see what's it actually like to be you as a human being and share our own vulnerable reality of what it's like to be a human being. And in this framework, we might think of therapeutic progress as moving from a world in we're mostly preoccupied with ourselves, talking to ourselves about ourselves, trying to get our desires met, and really concerned with what everybody thinks about us and what we think of ourselves, to a world in which we're mostly connected to others and not so concerned with this. And to end, there's a quote I love from Wei Wu Wei, who was actually a British philosopher, but he wrote under the pen name of Wei Wu Wei, masquerading as a Taoist sage. And he said, why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you think and everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one. So these are our antidotes again. Tanya generously mentioned this book. This book really digs into how we can develop this kind of transpersonal awareness, both, there isn't a lot of emphasis on psychedelics, through mindfulness practice, as well as through other methods, so that we can be less self-preoccupied and really embrace the lovely vulnerability and connection that comes from being ordinary. And this is how you can contact me. It's easy. It's just drronsiegel.com. And again, if you want to have more materials about this and hear about other things along these lines, please send a blank email. You can do it now from your phone to handouts@yahoo.com with the subject line, Just Right Australia. I'll know where this came from. And now we have a few minutes if people have questions. Or Tanya, how are you going to do it? You're going to have people put it in the chat?
Yes. Yes, we'll put it in the chat, Ron. Ilan, would you be able to put the whole gallery on so that we can all see one another, and then we can also see the chat? Hang on one moment.
What?
So let me just see the questions in the chat. If you can put your questions into the chat, folks, that'll be fantastic. Usually we're bombarded, but I think you were so mesmerizing, Ron, that people haven't had time to think of any questions.
And they don't have to be questions. They can be your own reflections on these topics. It's, you know, it's not like I've got the expertise here. I'm just sharing one way of looking at why and how non-ordinary states can be quite useful therapeutically across disorders.
So there's a question here from Sam who says, what is your understanding of the potential of psychedelics in group-based therapies?
Well, this is relatively new in the above board community. Obviously, in ayahuasca ceremonies and other underground activities, a lot of things are done and have been done in groups, and in many indigenous cultures, these are done in groups. The place where I know the most research going on in this is the Aquilino Cancer Center outside of Baltimore, associated with Johns Hopkins University. And what they're trying to do is they're looking for a way to scale psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy by having there be group therapy for preparation. The medicine sessions are individual, but there's one kind of master teacher watching on video a number of separate sessions, and there's a single guide in each room, and then the integration sessions are done in groups. And so far, their preliminary results look quite promising because the safe social connection is so important. So when people feel connected during the preparation sessions, and then they feel connected during the integration sessions, they're getting the benefit of being part of a community, and that itself has healing potential, especially when they're opened up like this. But again, it's quite preliminary. They haven't published a lot of research yet.
Thank you so much. It's certainly one of the things that we're looking at with our Healthy Persons trial for therapists. So that's going to be done in groups of 6, I think, 6 therapists at a time with either MDMA or psilocybin-assisted therapy. Fascinating, I think, to look at some of the outcomes. There's a question here around dementia, and there's from Vanessa, is there any use for this for people with dementia? Of course, there are some trials going on at Johns Hopkins and so on. But would you like to comment on that, Ron, and your own sort of thoughts on dementia and mindfulness, as well as psychedelic-assisted therapy as well?
Yeah, you know, dementia with mindfulness is kind of hard because usually as people lose other capacities, like, you know, Alzheimer's, for example, memory goes early. Often attentional capacity is lost also. So the ability to stay with an object is harder. I would think that the compassion, and this is speculative, no research on this, but that the compassion and self-compassion practices are going to be more useful. It is really hard to lose your cognitive capacities. And one of the ways in which it's hard is the horrible self-esteem crash, right? You know, gosh, you know, I used to be a smart person. An awful lot of us have used thinking that we were smart as a way to feel okay about ourselves. I certainly use thinking that I'm smart to try to undo the pain of countless athletic teams that I wasn't picked for in elementary school, countless girlfriends that at some point or another felt they were more interested in somebody else. And then I doubled down on, you know, writing books or whatnot, right? And I don't think I'm alone in this. So when we start, I mean, it's hard to lose physical capacities, but losing mental capacities for some people is even rougher. So anything that can help us feel safely connected, anything that can have compassion for ourselves, if indeed we could help somebody have the kind of transpersonal experience where they really felt part of the larger universe and really got it that, you know, what's born dies, then I think that would be wonderful. But I don't know. I think we have to see and tread carefully here because it could be overwhelming. And, you know, during integration phases, we really need our frontal lobes. We really need the capacity to think and reflect about our experience and put it in a historical context and start to make sense out of what happened. And if we don't have those kind of cognitive capacities, you know, I don't know if it would be scary and overwhelming, because we certainly don't want to just frighten people.
Absolutely not. And I think I mean, one of the theories, as you'll be familiar with, is that psilocybin in particular has the potential, obviously, of reconnecting those neural pathways. So I think that's why with some of the trials, and I know of one company called Elucis in New York that are using subperceptual doses of psilocybin, I think, to work with patients with early stage cognitive decline and so on, to see how they might be able to reconnect some of those pathways, which I think is fascinating and
I mean,
not fun.
I just want to say that, you
Yeah.
know, microdosing and things,
Yes.
that calls out for a lot of clinical study because
Yes.
placebo effects are so powerful. We have a whole center for placebo studies at one of the Harvard teaching hospitals, and the stories of what happens when people take sugar pills, they're so transformative for people. So I think it's going to be and that's not to knock placebo interventions. We have innate healing, which is unlocked often by simply thinking that I've taken something that's going to help me, and then we help ourselves. So this is not to be in any way pejorative toward that, but I do think with the whole, microdosing, taking doses that are not perceptual, it's a ripe area for research to figure out, is it the medicine? Is it the thought that I'm taking the medicine? What is having the effect here?
Absolutely. And by the way, we'll all be hearing from Jim Fadiman in a few weeks. So he's an expert on microdosing. Question here, and we often get this question, which is, what about people who are taking medications like antidepressants? And obviously the need for those people to taper off, Ron, before they, join any of these studies or trials or these sorts of treatments. Did you want to comment on that further?
I'm not as expert on that as I think some of my physician colleagues would be, that indeed there are interactions that can happen between many kinds of prescription psychotropic medicines and these and psychedelic medicines. And most people are advised under most circumstances to taper off first. When it comes to SSRIs and related antidepressants, since the literature is showing that except for people with major depressive disorder, much of the beneficial effects are indeed placebo effects, so much has to do with the person's attitude and belief. It's a complex matter to think this through. And, there's a lot. I mean, I totally applaud the enthusiasm of Mind Medicine Australia and the political efforts to get this studied, but we need to study these things.
And we totally support that too, Ron. That's why we invest a lot in funding novel research.
Yeah, and even though many of us have had personally absolutely transformative, undeniably transformative experiences, so that it's not a question for the N of one. In other words, for the person who has had this experience, there's no doubt about what happened here. Figuring out what's going to be helpful for others, that's what requires research.
Absolutely. And the protocols and, what's going to work as in terms of pre and post. Like, for example, there's a question here from Chris, which says, when trying psychedelics with a therapist, how do you establish trust relationships so quickly with the therapist? I mean, a lot of people are suggesting that, there wants to be more pre-medicine sessions and more post-medicine sessions than what there are in the trials at the moment. And I imagine you agree with that.
I suspect that's what we're going to need, particularly the post sessions. I mean, there might be a way to assess early on how much rapport and how much connection do we have, and is it okay to try a medicine session? But certainly, one of the things that has hounded a little bit the wonderful MAPS stage 3 studies on MDMA for PTSD is that some people report, yeah, it worked. My PTSD symptoms are resolved, but I'm opened up now in a way that I don't quite know how to navigate the world being this raw. And I think when that happens, people need a lot of ongoing therapeutic support. Not that a bad thing has happened, but something that support has happened. And it is the nature of research studies to have endpoints. And so absolutely, this is, healing people is not easy. I've gone through the sort of universals why all of us are predisposed towards psychological suffering. We didn't begin to talk about what it's like to have an inadequate attachment history, what it's like not to really be sufficiently loved and held as a child, what it's like to have been exposed to scary things as a child. There's a reason why ACE scores, that stands for Adverse Childhood Events, ACE scores, predict so many problems in mental and physical health. Because if you had a rough go of it as a child, chances are that you didn't get the basic resources that you're going to need to navigate adulthood. And while psychedelics can be, apparently can be, and I trust that we'll find ways to make them super helpful as an accelerant to therapy, and even helping people to begin to feel loved and lovable who have never had that experience, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to need a lot of other forms of support, because it's not so easy to cultivate those kinds of inner resources, even with the help of psychedelic medicines.
No, I mean, we strongly believe that the aftercare, not just the integration, but the ongoing aftercare, the nature of people's daily practice is critical. In fact, we've just announced a $1 million research fund for observational research trials in Australia. I'm particularly interested in trials with veterans and first responders, but also with people with eating disorders, but also in terms of what kind of aftercare tools and techniques could be attached to the psychedelic-assisted therapies treatments, so that they become part of a whole protocol that is not just about psychedelic-assisted therapy on its own.
And it is very difficult to be a human being, even when we've had a relatively good run of it. when we haven't had a lot of bad trauma, and we didn't suffer really bad neglect. The whole myth of normalcy, this crazy idea that there are these people we call normal running around who are psychologically well adjusted, and these poor people. Yes, there are some people who have worse symptoms than others, but one of the things you learn from mindfulness practice, everybody's symptomatic. Everybody is constantly trying to escape experience. Everybody's getting caught in their thought stream and is unable to be fully present in the moment. These are universal human problems that come from the way our brain evolved. And yes, in the clinical cases, it's worse, but it's really just worse along a continuum. It's not that our patients are in some way other than the rest of us. They just have a harder go of the same things that we're all having difficulty with. So this is, again, a sort of a little bit of a calling to look at the universals here and see how in the psychedelic assisted work, we can really purposefully address some of these universal problems that we have in being human.
Yeah, well, one of my friends who's a wonderful leader always says, we're all weirdos,
Yeah, totally.
And there's been some books called that as well. There's a question here from Steve who says the psychedelic experience should be to help us see the incredible depth in ordinary life. Many people taking psychedelics get stuck in the psychedelic world. What can you say about this?
My friend and early meditation teacher, Jack Kornfield, who's done a lot to introduce mindfulness practices to the West, one of his books has a title that should win a Pulitzer for the title. It's After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. And this applies in meditative traditions equally as in psychedelic traditions. People who do intensive meditation retreats, you can get really, really stoned at an intensive meditation retreat. You can develop states of mind in which a rock is just a magical friend, and in which trees are quite remarkable, and the wind is a fully enveloping experience. And we get attached to it. Right? Oh, I like that a lot better than doing my taxes. Oh, I like that a lot better than worrying about what everybody thinks about me. Oh, I like that much better than noticing my aging and feeling inadequate. We get hooked on highs. It's simply human to do that. We approach pleasure and we avoid pain. Clearly, psychedelics can bring about ecstatic experiences, these experiences of oneness, the transpersonal experiences that I was just, alluding to in my talk. And yeah, they feel so much better than, worrying about whether I should have the salmon or the lasagna tonight, right? I mean, so many everyday difficulties that these experiences take us away from. And maturity in spiritual practice and in psychological development is about the laundry. It's about realizing, okay, what are the insights that I can get from these profound, even sometimes ecstatic experiences, and how can I use them to live as an ordinary human being with deeper, more real connections to others, with making connections rather than impressions, with less self-preoccupation, with more awareness of reality, of the fact that everything changes and I'm going to die and so are you. How can we use these practices to align ourselves to the very ordinary reality of being a mammal briefly alive on this planet? And the good thing is it is possible, but absolutely it is quite easy to get caught on, oh, let me recreate that ecstatic state. I like that so much. And people who do that, who wind up taking psychedelics regularly, which is not what is done in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, they get themselves in trouble. At very least, they wind up delaying development. They wind up staying kind of high, but not doing the developmental work that's needed to have meaningful relationships, to have meaningful work, to be able to take care of oneself and the like, because we need these experiences in the service of leading very ordinary lives.
Ram Dass famously talked about how he tried to stay high for 40 straight days and then realized that he couldn't. And then, of course, he went to India and he found, true happiness and meaning and purpose through that experience. So,
and Ram Dass said about that also, if I recall correctly, at a certain point, I started thinking, instead of how do I stay or get high, what is it that feels not high about the rest of the time? What is it that I'm having trouble with when I'm not high? And that's the laundry. That's the, oh, okay, what are my shadow elements, my demons, if you will, that I need to find a way to connect with and integrate? What's the simple humility of realizing that, gosh, I'm vulnerable, I make mistakes all the time, I've spent a whole lifetime trying to puff myself up to try to feel good about myself, and the other kinds of things that people notice when they're on psychedelics or notice in meditation retreats. How do we take that to heart and realize, okay, so what if I were just like Ron, right? Just, like this mortal person. And ironically, there's peace, there's meaning, there's richness, there's fulfillment that comes from settling into this very ordinary life. But it's a challenge because there's a lot of factors and forces pulling us in other directions.
Very, very insightful, Ron. There's a question here from a psych student who says, any advice for students in this space? And then says, anything you wish you'd done, read in your 20s? And I guess there's also questions here. I'm amalgamating a few of them. What do you wish you'd done, read, known in your 20s? And what have your own psychedelic experiences taught you, but in a succinct sort of answer?
Okay, well, I can combine these.
Okay.
I probably would have been a mechanical engineer, except that when I was 17 years old, I took LSD. I had read a book that was called The Psychedelic Experience back then, written by Tim Leary, Richard Alpert, before he became Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner, who was a pioneer in this field, that described stages of psychedelic experience that culminated in a profound transpersonal experience of feeling quite ordinary, but quite part of the larger universe. And it happened on a street corner in suburban New York to me, a 17-year-old kid. I thought, well, this is very interesting. To tell you the actual truth, I thought, wow, an answer that doesn't involve trying to figure things out with my crazy girlfriend. That was my thought at the time, because I was going up and down, up and down. We're together, apart every other week, right? And I foolishly had, as many people do, a kind of inflation about this. Like, oh, now I've seen the truth. In fact, I saw the world as divided into people who see the truth and people who don't see the truth. I don't see the world divided that way anymore. But at the time, that's what mattered to me. And I thought, who knows about this? And I started looking at meditative practices and who are the teachers in the meditation space. And I actually majored in religion as an undergraduate, even though I had no theistic beliefs and I was inclined to be a mechanical engineer, but I was so interested in trying to figure this out. I'm glad to have had that inquiry. I wish I saw earlier on all of the insidious ways in which our attempts to improve our rank in the primate troop will turn absolutely everything and anything into fodder for trying to build self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
For example, at the very beginning, oh, the world is divided into people who have seen this transpersonal reality and those who haven't. And I'm among the ones who've seen, right? Already, hey, Ron's cool. Look at this. And on and on and on. I wish I had gotten it earlier in my life, how utterly, utterly fruitless trying to feel good about ourselves through social comparison is as a pathway to well-being. But I don't know, it's hard to see that stuff when you're younger. It's, we get so addicted to, oh, she liked me. Oh, that person respected me. Oh, I was given this opportunity. Oh, I must be smart or special or kind or popular or funny. It's so addictive. And now with social media, it is so, it's like crack cocaine, it's like from coca leaves to crack cocaine with social media. So it's hard to give it up. I did write the book with that intention of like, maybe some people could see it a little bit sooner than I saw it. And wouldn't that be nice for their lives? That was actually the intention behind this new book. So that's the thing I wish I knew.
How beautiful. I've already reached out. I want to order your book as soon as possible. There's so many questions here. Have you got another 5 minutes if we just do some quick?
Yeah. No, I'm fine. I'm already past my bedtime, so I'm on second wave.
Okay. A question here about, is work with brain injury clients feasible? There is some work going on in that space. Have you seen anything around that?
I don't have a lot of expertise in that. I would think that many of the same questions that come up around dementia would come up around brain injury, even though, it depends on what kind of brain injury and, where the impairment is and that sort of thing. But I don't really know. I haven't had any kind of personal experience with that.
Well, that's fine. A question here. What is your view on the concern around having a therapeutic trip and then deciding you don't care about your job, your status, maintaining your house? I think there is a lot of resistance because some of my clients are worried all their hard work will be undone if they let go. Yeah.
Well, this is really, really interesting because it turns out that when we see the folly of our addiction to various treatments in order to try to basically feel better about ourselves and think that I'm successful or good or whatever our criteria is to have one of these little self-esteem boosts to basically raise our rank in the primate troop. When we see through it, we do not typically become nihilistic. We become interested in things that matter more. We become interested in loving connection with other people. We actually become interested in nature and in, oh my God, trees are beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
How can we not destroy the planet anymore? What can I do about that? We become interested in, I'd like to share, or I'd like to help my patients. My gosh, they are suffering so, they're in so much pain. It is not, interestingly, we think that we need this kind of competitive treadmill in order to put out energy toward good purposes. It is one fuel, but there's plenty of other forms of fuel that are so much more gratifying. And it's so interesting. For example, for me, when I'm in a teaching role right now at the moment, when I'm in this teaching role and I'm mostly focused on how do I sound? Was that clever? Are people going to think I'm good? Will they invite me to do more? When I'm mostly in the, where am I in the primate troop mode? Yeah, I'm teaching, but it's not so much fun. And I'm not really so connected with the people that I'm teaching. When I'm in the mode of how can I be useful here? What can I share about my own experience that actually rings true and I believe in, that might help some other people to suffer less or help therapists to help others to suffer less? Then I'm alive, I'm engaged, and it feels like a win-win all along. I think it's possible to do virtually anything that we do with less narcissism and more connection and wind up doing it better, having a better result, and enjoying the process much more and doing more good for the world.
Beautiful. And it's sort of, that's aligned also to that state of flow you know, that letting go, as this question really talks about. There's a question here from John. Oh, I'll respond to this one just very briefly, John, about insights updates for substance addiction, especially alcohol and harder drugs. So there's a lot of trials going on in the world at the moment that are showing really good outcomes around substance addiction. And there's one that Ben Sess is leading in at Bristol and with Imperial as well on alcohol addiction. Ron, did you want to make any comments about that whole addiction space?
Well, only that it makes so much sense. You know, I have a friend and colleague named Judd Brewer. He's a psychiatrist and runs the mindfulness program at Brown University, which is a major university south of Boston. And he wrote a wonderful book called Craving. And it's really about when we're struggling with substances. It was what I began with my playful talk about the wine. We're having some experience that we're really having trouble tolerating, and we desperately want the substance in order to make this experience go away. And if we can learn instead to be with that painful experience, including be with the experience of, I'd really like a drink or a shot, whatever, right now, in order to make that experience go away. And we realize, oh, that too is an impermanent experience. That too is something that I can move toward and open. Then bit by bit, we become freer. And I don't want to be Pollyanna about it. I don't want to suggest that this is easy. You know, addictions are very, very hard. And they're mostly very, very hard because they're self-treatment for trauma. And trauma is very, very hard, dealing with all of the hurts and all of the pain. But since these medicines really do seem to help us to be able to feel safe in approaching our pain, it serves to reason that they should be able to help us with this. And I know it's confusing sometimes because people think, well, people take those medicines to get high and you don't want people to get high, et cetera. It is very different to take a medicine in order to get high and escape from an experience than is to take a medicine in order to open to and enter into an experience. As Tanya, I'm sure you know, in the MDMA styles that MDMA trials that MAPS is doing, you know, the modal response on the part of people going through this is, why do they call it ecstasy? Because people were facing horrible traumas. They were facing longings. They were facing loss. They were facing loneliness. Yes, they were facing it with love, and that was transformative. But my gosh, the material they were working with was not some eroticized dancing at a club. It's a whole other kettle of fish. So much has to do with our intention in using these medicines. And when using them to work with our demons, then we're using them to be able to free ourselves from addictive patterns.
Yeah, you described this so beautifully, this bridge between the non-ordinary to the ordinary. Whereas I think a lot of people think we're going from the ordinary to the non-ordinary to be something special. I really think the way you've reversed that is really fascinating. Do you, I mean, there's lots more questions. We don't unfortunately have time to answer them, right? And we want you to go to bed and have your beauty sleep. But is there some papers that you mentioned sharing some papers? We usually send a thank you note out. If there's some particular papers that you'd also like us to share, we'll also share your book title. Ilan, if you could make a note that we'll share the link to order Ron's book on the thank you note, but also Ron, if you want to send us any other papers.
Okay, let me think about that a little bit. It may take me a little bit of time because I'm going off to Europe tomorrow to actually lead a silent meditation retreat in Spain. And
I want to come to that. Where's that?
What's that?
I want to come to that. That sounds amazing.
And also, therefore, those of you who please, thank you very much for sending the email. It may take me a little while to get things together, but I will try to get together both an elaborate set for those of you who sent me the email and something that you can send out to everybody, Tanya.
Beautiful. Well, have a great time in Europe. How many days is the silent retreat?
It's about a 6-day retreat. Beautiful. So that should be interesting.
I mean, if there's any retreats, by the way, that you're doing and leading that you want us to share with our network, just let me know and we'll share them.
Okay, thank you very much. That would be great.
And thank you for being part of our advisory panel. We really respect and honour you and just give you a huge round of applause for your incredible wisdom, your insights, your knowledge and your warmth. It's just been beautiful spending this time with you. So thank you. Lots of love.
You're welcome. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank all of you who are here for your interest and those who are going to view the recording at another time.
Big rounds of applause to you. Thank you, everyone. And if you've enjoyed this webinar, please bring a handful of people to the next, and we'll keep expanding. And Ron, we'd love you to present again sometime in the coming weeks. And we hope to have a summit later next year, which we'd love to bring you to Australia for.
Oh, I haven't been down under in a while, but I would be, schedules permitting, I would love to join you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a beautiful day, evening, wherever you are in the world. Take care.